I would like to elaborate on something I touched on in the previous videos around the Westminster attack, and that was the the criticism from some people that the London attack and attacks in Western countries, or even tragedies in Western countries, get a lot more coverage than other things going on in the world. So I want to discuss this a little bit because it is an interesting thing, and there is certainly some truth in it. Well, there is truth in it. Um, I can understand where the criticism lies because the understanding is, well, four people, not including the attacker, died in London. There are much bigger examples of bloodshed happening all over the world. So why does London get so much attention? I think there's numerous reasons for this. Um, Firstly, I think it's misguided to say four victims because sometimes when we think of terrorism, we do overlook the injured. So actually, it's 45 victims. They estimate about 40 people were injured, four people killed. So that's 45 victims, 44, 45. The figures are going around, but it's somewhere between 40 and 50 were injured, some of them seriously. So I think it's wrong to kind of downplay the injured, and I think sometimes that's another factor. Um, there's been a number of things happening around the world that I have only found out through sort of online reports. Um, Today, 50 civilians were killed in the Central African Republic. Armed men raided a village, 50 people killed, scores injured. Today, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or at least in the last few days, 40 police officers were decapitated by militias. And in the last few days, as many as 230 civilians, or at least 230 people, including civilians, may have died in airstrikes in Mosul, in northern Iraq. Now, none of these things, needless to say, get anywhere near the attention of the Westminster attack, which is on a much smaller scale. So let's think about this for a minute. Why do they get this attention? Firstly, the Westminster attack occurred in a country that is not in a state of war. Britain's not at war, in the sense we're not having an internal civil conflict. Now, the Central African Republic is a failed state and it's been in a state of war for the last 5, 6 years. The Democratic Republic of Congo, again, a failed state, one of the most dismal places on earth. In fact, it's a country that saw the most devastating war in terms of fatalities since World War II. Although it should be said, when we think of the Second Congo War, a lot of those fatalities come about not necessarily from violence, but from war war related deaths, i.e., deaths that wouldn't have occurred without the war situation. A lot of that is disease and so on, which some would say is dubious in being included in war fatalities, but there you have it. Nevertheless, I think everyone can agree that it is one of the world's most bleak places. Iraq, it's a full scale war. This war with ISIS in northern Iraq, it's classed as a major war, like Syria. When we think about conflicts tend to be divided into full scale wars. That is those which are, you see major intense battles going on, large civilian casualties, and a conflict that is entire affecting the entire nation. Examples would be Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, um, parts of Nigeria certainly, and parts of Mexico certainly. I would argue. I mean, over 100,000 people have died in the Mexican drug war. I would call that a full-scale war. Um, and yet, in the case of Mexico, there's parts of Mexico that are far less impacted than other parts. Again, with Pakistan, it's a big country, and you have parts of the country that are much more affected than other parts, and Nigeria. I mean, Lagos is barely impacted by the conflict with Boko Haram in the way that northern Nigeria is. So that's another factor to look at when we're thinking of conflicts. But in the case of Syria and Iraq, I think it's fair to say pretty much the whole countries are impacted. So, in terms of numbers of people killed, the Westminster attack is minuscule, really, compared to some of the things that are going on around the world. Even if we look at another war that some would say is not accurately described as a war, but certainly bloody, the Philippine Drug War. Over 6,000 killed in that conflict. Very controversial. There's fierce defenders of it and there's fierce critics of it on both sides. Um, so, if you look at conflicts around the world, there is a source online. It's from Wikipedia, so how accurate it is down to opinion. But it's a list of ongoing conflicts, and that divides conflicts up into those that are classed as major conflicts. That is over 1,000 deaths in the previous year versus kind of low level insurgencies. Now, the world currently has somewhere in the region of 35 to 40 armed conflicts going on. Most of them are classed as low level. So, an example of a low level conflict would be the current situation in Peru, whereby there is not total peace in the country, but it's far less intense than it was in the 80s and the 90s. Another example would be the Casamance separatist conflict in Angola or with Angola. Excuse me, Cabinda, Casamance with Senegal. So there's a lot of examples of low-level conflicts where the death toll is relatively low compared to other parts of the world, but nevertheless there is still a political conflict going on. Chechnya is another example. It far it better improved, de-escalated from the height of the two brutal wars there, but there is still violence that goes on. A few days ago, 6 Russian soldiers were killed. So these are conflicts that don't necessarily get to the headlines. They're still going on. Then you get large-scale conflicts, like say Syria and Iraq. Now, let's look at the Congo. Why would that not get the same sort of attention as London? Well, there's an assumption that it's always kind of Western bias, that Western lives matter more. I can understand where that comes from, but it's not entirely. People need to understand that sometimes there are actual restrictions to what journalists can report. I mean, and not just in the case of war, in the case of other disasters, there have been very devastating floods in Zimbabwe this year, almost 300 people killed. Now, in that case, the government of Zimbabwe under Mugabe has actually banned the BBC from reporting. So that's an example where you can't really blame an organization like the BBC because they are having their hands tied. They can't report there. Likewise, you get countries that are authoritarian like China. Again, there's severe restrictions on press freedom. So it isn't always a case that it's kind of this editorial decision, oh, well, Western lives matter more. Sometimes journalists really are restricted in what they can report. So that's also something to look at. Now, in the case of major conflicts like Syria and Iraq, um, I think in a conflict like Syria, the situation is so grim and so, there's bloodshed every single day. It would literally be impossible for any big network to have constant coverage of every single atrocity that happens in a country like Syria, because it would literally be 24-hour coverage. And what would happen would be people would be so sickened they would simply not watch the news. And I don't believe that the news should be entertainment. It shouldn't be what people want to hear. But at the same time, editors need to make the decision of, well, we're trying to convey what's going on in the world, and we want to do that in a way that doesn't make people so fatigued with negative news that they just don't watch it. So they do need to balance things out. Now, there is an argument that by reporting, for example, the Westminster incident so much, it gives terrorists ammo. I can understand the criticism. I mean, Westminster, it was small scale compared to other attacks. It was much smaller scale than, say, the 7th of July London bombings 12 years ago. And I've worked out that it ranks fifth in London terrorist attacks. I've done a bit of research on this. Number one was 7/7. Number two was actually the Clerkenwell outrage, 1867. That was the then Fenian Brotherhood tried to blow up Clerkenwell prison. It went wrong. 21 people were killed. Um, Third was London Park bombings by the IRA in 1982. Fourth was the Harrods bombing, 6 killed. This attack currently ranks as the fifth worst in London. Of modern times, I mean, of the last 150 years, not including before that. Um, and in UK terms, it's way down. There's been far worse outrages than this. But I think it's getting the attention is because it's the first mass casualty Islamist attack since 7/7. Um, and like I said, I think the reason terrorist attacks get more attention than, say, I don't know, let's say there was a gas explosion and 5 people were killed, it would get some attention, but not to the same extent. The difference is that's a tragic accident, whereas a terrorist attack is a man-made atrocity. So I think that factor definitely comes into it, because there is an ideology out there. So there would be there is one school of thought that says don't report these things, at least not to this extent, because that's what terrorists want. I can definitely see the logic in that, but I don't think you can honestly expect an editor not to cover these things. Is there excessive coverage? There might be an argument that there is. Um, but in terms of this is what terrorists want, I'm not sure about that. I think what terrorists want is to inflict casualties. Yeah, I don't think Khalid Masood had a particular desire to be famous. I think he was just driven by hatred. So I'm not so sure I believe that theory that terrorists want the attention. Certainly, it helps ISIS propaganda, but if the BBC and the media didn't report these things to the extent that they did, does that mean that ISIS is suddenly going to have a change of heart? I don't think so. I think these people want to inflict pain and suffering regardless of how the media portrays it. I really do. In terms of coverage of atrocities and so on going on around the world, there's another factor to look at. This was an attack in the UK, so naturally the British Broadcasting Corporation is going to talk about something that's happened in this country. Um, so when people on the other side of the world complain about that, well, I mean, there'll be things going on in Nigeria that Nigerian media is covering that we are not covering. But that is because it's happening domestically in Nigeria, so Nigerian news networks will be covering that. I think, there's this expectation that Western networks have to cover everything. Now, to be fair, that's partly because of the influence that they have. The BBC is the world's biggest broadcaster in terms of numbers of employees. It's certainly the oldest of the major broadcasters, and it is hugely influential. So I suppose there is that argument to make. To be fair, BBC World Service still covers a very wide range of issues. If you switch on to the BBC at 2 or 3 in the morning, they're covering all sorts of issues all over the world. But like the BBC 6 or 7 o'clock news, they'll be focusing on British issues. But it is, after all, the British Broadcasting Corporation, just like Fox News focuses on American issues. France 24 focuses on French issues. Um, so that's another way to look at it. If I was an editor, I would be covering what's happened in Mosul. I would be trying to get a balance with those things. But I think when it comes to total wars, it practically isn't possible to cover everything. I do think Mosul is a major issue. I do think when it, 230 civilians may have died, I think that's a major story. I believe that should be covered. But I don't think it's entirely fair to say this is some sort of racist bias that media networks have. I think honestly sometimes there are restrictions because you get authoritarian governments block networks from doing their job. And bear in mind, it is a lot safer for a reporter to go to Westminster Bridge and interview police officers than it is to go to Syria and risk their life in that way. Um, so, reporters do a very important job, but that's another thing to think about. Anyway, let me know your thoughts. Do you think there is a Western media bias in this? Personally, if I was an editor, I would be talking about Mosul a bit more. I would be talking about the Central African Republic and the Congo a bit more. But I do understand why it isn't always possible to have reporters on the ground reporting every single detail. And I think people need to bear that in mind. It isn't always black and white. And I don't think you could present it as, oh, they just can't be bothered because they're Africans. I really don't think it's that simple. Okay, thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts.